In chapter 2, we learned of the pagans and the self-righteous and the Gentiles that are all condemned. So the Jews are God's chosen people who have the law, but are they any better off that they have the law? No. The law's there for them. It was given to them by God, but they're no better off having that law. And that's what Paul's trying to get them to understand here. You're blessed with the law, but it's not going to save you now. The day Christ died, was buried, resurrected, the law did not apply anymore. Because at that point in time, the blood of Christ is what saved you. Now let's look at a couple of the Jewish rituals that they do. What did the Jews trust? In verses 17 through 29, we're going to see that the Jews keep external rituals such as the law and circumcision. Now, what he's doing here is pointing out what they have. This is what God has given you. And despite the Jews being under Roman rule during this time of Paul's writing, the Jews considered themselves the elite people of the world because they felt God gave us the law, so we're better than everybody. Yeah, we're under your Roman rule, but that doesn't matter. We're still better than you are. I think I mentioned it last week. When you start thinking you're better than someone else and you sin less than someone else, what was the term I used? Woe be unto you. Because then you're going to realize that you're not what you think you are. Now in verse 17, they put their confidence in the law and they trusted it to save them. They even boasted about it. In verse 17 of chapter 2, behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, which means rest or love in the law, and makest thy boast of God. In verse 18, we see that the Jews' awareness of God was not a working knowledge, and that they would have gained more knowledge if they had had experience in it. It says in verse 18, and knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, be instructed out of the law. Now their knowledge came only through written revelations of the law, because during this time they did not live the law when it was written. That was hundreds and hundreds of years ago at this time. So all they had was the written revelations of the law as to what happened and what you should and shouldn't do and what you're, the law tells you what God commands. It also tells you what he forbids, what he approves, and what rewards he'll give you. They only had that written knowledge. They didn't have any actual experience from that knowledge. When Paul says in verse 18, and approvest the things that are more excellent, he's actually referring to a verse in Philippians 1 verse 10 where it says that ye may approve things that are excellent. Paul does a lot of referencing into the New Testament, but he also does a lot of referencing to the Old Testament to show justification for what he's trying to say. Now these words, and approvest the things that are more excellent, what these words are really referring to is the fact of having the sense of right and wrong and the ability to even identify these differences and what is right within the law. Now in verse 19 through 20, Paul shows that the Jews even directed and instructed people. In verses 19 through 20, it says, and art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which has the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. They had the law, and they had the ability and was given the opportunity to teach the law to other people. That was a gift they had. But as we're going to see, they misused it. Now, having the law gave the Jews the ability to give spiritual insight and light to those in darkness. And what we see in these verses is so far that this is all privileges that God has given the Jews. But in verses 21 through 24, Paul is going to have some piercing questions for them. What we see here is Paul indicting the Jews for hypocrisy. They were not practicing what they preached, and they were not doing, and they were actually doing what they were saying not to do. And we'll go over that. The first question we see is in verse 21. Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? That little statement right there hit me hard. Because I stand up here. Brother John has stood up here. Others have stood up here. And I think about everything I'm saying to you guys. And I have to sit back and go, am I doing it? I'm telling them what they should do based on the Word. Am I doing it? If you get up here and you don't question yourself, you don't need to be up here. I've learned that. Because so many times I've thought back, hey, I said something to somebody and told them they shouldn't do it, and here I am doing it. This becomes important later on. He even talks about in the end of verse 21, he references the word stealing. Now over in Matthew 23:14, Jesus said that the Pharisees devoured widows' houses. They stole from the widows. And you know that's a no-no. Based on the law, that's a no-no. But the Pharisees did. Evidently, that's what the Jews were doing here. They were stealing and extorting money from the helpless and the widows. Also, we're going to see in verse 22 that undoubtedly that the Jews were guilty of adultery and committing sacrilege. Or better said, they were robbing the temple. Verse 22, thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? It amazes me how Paul doesn't say, you are committing this sin. He asked them, you speak about adultery, but are you committing it? He already knows the answer to that. They are. But he's given that person a chance to acknowledge their sin. You understand what I'm saying? The Jews even shunned idols, but it appears that they were not above selling idols, especially the ones that came from heathen temples for financial gain. That's probably where the old cliche of talking about Jews making money. They made money off whatever they could make money off. That drove them. It drove them here. No, we're not going to worship idols as Jews, but we'll sell them. That'd be like me. I abhor anything like dirty movies and stuff, but I go out there and I open up a business. Well, I'm not going to do it, but I'll sell it to people. You can't do that. And that's what they were doing here. And that's what he was pointing out to them. The Jews were even guilty of profaning the temple here, is what he says. In other words, when people, especially travelers, would come to the temple and they would want to offer a sacrifice for their sins, what the Jews were doing was, okay, here comes this out-of-towner. All right, we've got this turtle dove over here. Well, to the Jews here in town, we're going to sell that for $1. But he's the traveler, we're going to sell it to him for $3. So they're making money off of an innocent person coming to ask forgiveness for their sins and to offer a sacrifice. They would also take that traveler and say, okay, for you to buy this, what we need you to do first is we need you to transfer your Roman money into our temple money. But your $1, we're only going to give you 75 cents on. Even though it was worth $1, they were making them trade it for a lesser amount. So they were stealing. That's what he's referencing here. They stole from innocent people. Verse 23 even speaks about their boasting, that they had the law, but they did not obey it. In verse 23, thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the law dishonorest thou God. This is talking about covenant breakers and self-righteous people. Therefore, they dishonored God who had given them the law. You can't use the law to justify your salvation. What's in this book, you can do everything it says except one, and that's ask Christ for forgiveness. If you don't do that, doing everything else in this book, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't use the Lord's name, you can do all that. But if you don't accept Christ as your Savior, you're still going to go to hell. Too many people are focusing on rituals of good, thinking it's going to get them somewhere with God, and it's not going to happen. The Gentiles knew that the Jews were sinning, and they pretty much said, if these are God's people, we don't want your God. Verse 24 says, for the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. How many times have you heard people say, if that's the Christian life, I don't want it? He's doing exactly what I'm doing, but he's got too many constraints. So I'll just stay with what I'm doing with no constraints. When that happens and someone says that against a Christian, that is blasphemy of God. As a Christian, you are blaspheming God's name because you're not living what you're preaching and teaching. Think on this. We as believers should not teach. And these three things hit me pretty hard too. We as believers should not teach what we have not learned. It really frustrates me when I don't get enough study to get up here on Sunday. And I have to really force time constraints. I can't stand that. Because when I get up here, I want to be knowledgeable to teach. We must not preach what we do not practice. You can't go out there and tell people not to do something and you do it yourself. And we must not say that here, that there are things that are forbidden, but then we do them ourselves. Those three things we should think about every day in our lives. You're sitting at home by yourself doesn't mean you still don't sin. But when you're out in front of people, do you think about what you say and what you do? I try to all the time, because at the end of the day, I sit and think, did I offend somebody? Did I say something I shouldn't have said? Or did I do something I shouldn't have done? It makes this very important. So God often is seen from the unsaved person's point of view. God is actually seen through the Christian and even through the church. When an unsaved person comes in this church, how are they treated? Because if they come in and sit down and no one, not even one person, says anything to them, they're going to sit there till the end of the service and think, ain't nothing special about this. The more I thought on that, I thought, I think every single one of us are going to be held accountable for that one person. How many people are we going to be held accountable for that we didn't even think about? When we stand before God and he says, Mark, what about Bill Simpson or Joe Smith? I'm like, who are they? Well, they walked in your church and sat down and you didn't even speak to them. And they were actually looking for salvation, but you didn't give it as a witness. That's frightening. How we live either honors God's name or it blasphemes it. The second ritual that the Jews followed a lot was circumcision. And since the Jews had to face the undeniable charges that Paul was bringing up to them right now, they fell back on the covenant sign of circumcision, which was given between God and Abraham and reinforced between God and Moses. okay, we're not following the law so much, but we do have circumcision. We do that. That was a covenant made between God and Abraham. Doesn't matter. It's irrelevant now. Because without one working with the other, they become useless. If God says you must have the law, follow the law, and have circumcision, which was done during Abraham's time, then that's what you did. But if you follow the law and didn't get uncircumcised, back in the day, you were still a sinner. You were still unworthy. If you got circumcised but didn't follow the law, you were still a sinner. But see, these people weren't even doing what they were supposed to be doing, and that's following the law and circumcision together, used as a symbol together. They weren't even doing that. Verses 25 through 27, it says, "For circumcision verily profiteth, if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision." Now, that doesn't mean you can be uncircumcised. What it's talking about is you're no better off. Even though you got circumcised, you're not following the law, so you're not any better off. Verse 26, "Therefore, if the uncircumcision keepeth the righteous of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision?" Basically, what he's saying here is a man that does keep the law, even if he doesn't get circumcised, God will look upon him just as much and just as much favor because he's keeping the law. Because the circumcision is just a ritual. Verse 27, "And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfill the law, judge thee, who by the letter and circumcision dost transgress the law?" Now they performed this ritual of circumcision as instructed. However, that symbol we've discussed here is meaningless. Over in Acts 10:4, you remember Cornelius? He's an uncircumcised Gentile. But he was more pleasing to God than Caiaphas, who was a circumcised Jew. Cornelius, his desire was to find God and to do what God wanted him to do, where Caiaphas was going by rituals and appearance. Dressed, he was a circumcised Jew, he carried the law, but he was just as cold and dead in his heart because he gave that outward appearance. Verse 29, it says, "But he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but of God." The word circumcision from the heart here refers to the removal of what is evil within your heart. When it says anything in reference to circumcision of the heart, not of the physical appearance, but of the heart, it means removing everything sinful that is within your heart. It's also what they would call a renewed heart and pretty much living a spiritual life. Not a outward looking life. Look how well I dress, carry my Bible. Those are outward things. What is in the heart? Next we see in chapter 3 what the Jews might have argued back to Paul. Because one thing we have to realize here is Paul's words would have had to startle these Jews awake. Because they were raised that they were special people, they were superior people, and that circumcision and the covenant of the law was their relationship to God. But Paul's trying to get them to understand there's a new relationship. That's Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, his grace that he can give you in salvation. Paul knew he'd smashed them too with his statements. He knew he had crushed them. And he anticipates their objections, which we're getting ready to look at in chapter 3. Excuse me. In verse 1 through 8, he's going to deal with 4 inevitable objections. The first objection is in verse 1 and 2. "What advantage then hath the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? Much every way, chiefly because that unto them were committed the oracles of God." Their argument here is, what good is it to be a Jew then? I've got the law, I got circumcised. if I can still die and go to hell, what good is it? This guy over here who's not circumcised, but he follows the law, he gets to go to heaven, or he's judged less than I am. So why should I even be a Jew? That's their argument. The second objection we see is in verse 3. They're basically asking, what are the promises that God gave to the Jews in the nation of Israel? Are they canceled just because every Jew doesn't believeth? In verse 3 it says, for what if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? What does Paul say in verse 4? God forbid. Paul even quotes, in verse 4, Paul is actually, in part of this verse, quoting David. And in this verse, he particularly references Psalms 51, verse 4. Let me read this. In verse 4, it says, God forbid, yea, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged. Over in Psalms 51, verses 1 through, verse 4, it says, against thee, thee only, have I sinned, and done this evil in thy sight, that thou mightest be justified when thou speakest, and be clear when thou judgest. What they're doing here, when Paul is referencing an Old Testament scripture, specifically what he's doing here is referencing David and his sin and how he was going to be judged. He acknowledged how he was going to be judged. He asked God to judge him for his sin. How many of us have asked God to judge us for our sins? I mean, he was pretty much saying, Lord, bring all your judgment upon me because I've sinned against you. But too many times we want, Lord, don't bring your judgment. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do it. When we deserve every ounce of judgment he gives us, or could give us. We need to be thankful for God's faithfulness despite our own unfaithfulness. Because God's faithfulness does not give us a desire or a license to lack faith. What it does mean is that if in human weakness we are unfaithful. 2 Timothy 2:13 says, yet ye abide faithfully, you cannot deny himself. He cannot deny himself, even in our unfaithfulness. Imagine that your eternal destination rests on how faithful you were to certain rituals. How different would your life be now? If there's certain rituals that God said now, at this time, we're supposed to do, would you do them? How would it change your life? One simple ritual every morning is to get up and read the Bible. Do you do that? That's a ritual. Sometimes I fail at it and I don't read that day or for 2 days or whatever. But I tell you what, it bugs me until I can get myself caught back up. Can't stand it. But how do you feel? Knowing that there's certain rituals you could do to increase your knowledge, increase your faith, increase your trust in God, but we don't do them. The third objection in verse 5, it says, but if our unrighteousness commend the unrighteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unrighteous who taketh vengeance? I speak as a man. If unrighteousness or unbelief highlights God's righteousness, why should God take vengeance? That's basically what they're asking. This debater also would say our sin gives opportunity to God to exercise his mercy and grace. Otherwise, his characteristics never would be known. Then he says, is it fair, therefore, for God to punish? Yes, it is. Because God is not a partaker in sin. And to be a just God and to judge, he cannot be a partaker in sin. So why would you even ask that question? And in verse 6, Paul answers him by saying, God forbid, again. For then how shall God judge the world? If he partakes in sin, he can't justly judge you in the end. How many times do we ask a foolish question? I mean, they're just shooting in the dark. Well, God's got to be part of sin because, he can't justly. No, he's not. Don't come up with excuses, especially when you're wrong and mama and papa sit you down and they start pointing out where you're wrong. What do? You start squirming. Mind starts going. And how many excuses do your children come up with justifying why they did that? That's what they're doing here. They're squirming. They know they're wrong, and they're squirming. And all these objections are baseless. The fourth objection we see in verse 7 and 8. For if the truth of God hath more abounded through my lie unto his glory, why yet am I also judged as a sinner? And not rather as we be slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, let us do evil, that good may come, whose damnation is just. What they're saying here is if my lie actually makes the truth of God known and stand out, then I've actually done something good, and I shouldn't be punished for that. That's you trying to justify a sin. If my lying is wrong, but it brings God out, your lie will not bring God out. Sin does not highlight and glorify God. So again, you're using an excuse that has no basis and foundation. A lie is a lie. Next we see in verses 9 through 20, Paul speaks about the universal condemnation. In verse 9 we see the charge. What then, are we better than they? No, in no wise, for we have before proved both Jews and Gentiles that they are under sin. Then in verse 10 through 12 he states that all are not just the Jews and Gentiles, but all are sinners. In verses 10 through 12 it says, as it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understandeth, there is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way, they are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Psalms 14, verses 1 through 3. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. The Lord looketh down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. They were all gone aside. They are all together become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Paul references the Old Testament quite a bit, and he uses David because he knew David was someone they reverenced. Because they looked to him as a man of God. But Paul wanted them to understand David was also a sinner. And the man that you respect sinned, which means you do too. You're no different. Paul continues his case in verses 13 through 14. Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asp is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Their mouths are as putrid as an open sepulchre. What comes out of their mouth just purely stinks, is what he's saying. It's also as deadly as a poison asp. Every person at some point harbors bitterness and hate in their heart. I don't care how good you are. Paul then adds in verses 15 through 18 that people are totally sinful in their conduct. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways. In the way of peace have they not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. What he's saying here is they're murderers. Ruin and misery follow them. They do not know peace and they don't fear God. Lastly, we're going to see the verdict and the sentence. Paul returns to the Jews by addressing them under the law in verse 19. It says, now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. What he's saying is the law was given to them, and they were obliged to obey it, but they weren't. The problem is that no Jew could ever perfectly follow the law. There is no way any Gentile can perfectly follow the law. There is no way anyone can perfectly follow every word and page in this book. But it's given to us as a guideline so that we can do our best to live a righteous life. We can't take it lightly. Therefore, nobody can even think of defending themselves before God. When you stand before God, you can't grab this word and say, well, Lord, in here it's... He knows it better than you. I think of this week. It's getting pretty rough at work and everything, and attitudes and tempers are starting to flare. It gets kind of scary sometimes. But I remember talking to someone, and they said, the company has to follow the union contract and the way it was written. No, they don't. Because over the years, and this is what hit me, over the years, they negotiated. Every so often you negotiate a contract. So over the years, they negotiated the contract, moving a word, putting a different word, putting an and here and an and there, and a thee and a thou. Just little bits and pieces. According to the lawyers, union lawyers, as a union person, you look at that contract one way for what it says. He said, but I'm a union lawyer. I look at it totally different. And this sentence here saying that you're going to get this because it's got this new word in here, and, you ain't getting it. Because you looked at it from a novice's point of view. I'm looking at it from an expert's point of view. There's our contract. Read it for what it says and every word that it says. In verse 20, it says, therefore by the deeds of the law there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. Basically what it's saying here is works are insufficient, the law is insufficient, and justification only comes by salvation in Jesus Christ. These verses from verse 9 down through 20, there's no other single passage in the Bible that pretty much describes the total depravity of man than these verses right here. Now, total depravity doesn't mean that people are as evil as they can get, or they're as destitute of any moral values. Rather, it means that every part of their being has been affected by sin. A writer once said, if sin was the color of blue, my body would be different shades of blue. Every part of my body would be blue, but they would be different shades as to how bad they were versus how good they are. So no matter what good I do with this hand to honor God, if I go out and steal something, then sin has affected that tool that I use to honor God. Because sin affects every inch of us. Romans 8:8 says, so then that they are in the flesh cannot please God. You in the flesh, there's nothing you can do to totally please God. Because you please Him, and then you walk out the door and do something you shouldn't do, you're not pleasing unto Him anymore. God is the judge that has declared what? The wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. He that believeth not the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abideth in him, John 3:36. The evidence is overwhelming. We're guilty of the charges. These Jews were guilty of the charges Paul levied against them. The verdict is in, and the sentence is death. Unless you are born again, you will die, but where will you go? Next week, I want to look at grace and salvation. That's what we're here for. Brother Chavis, will you please close in prayer?